Clark Thomas Reed Sr. might not be a name that you are familiar with, even though he might have changed the course of contemporary history. At the time of the 1976 Republican Convention, Reed was the chairman of the Republican Party of Mississippi. At the Mississippi Republican State Convention, which was held on April 10th of that year, the delegates decided to send 30 uncommitted delegates to the National Convention in August in Kansas City, as there was no attempt to bind the delegates to either of the two candidates running for president, incumbent President Gerald Ford or former California Governor Ronald Reagan. However, the delegates to the convention also voted to institute the unit rule, a rule that made it that all of the delegates for Mississippi had to vote as a unit and that the delegation could not be split. The Ford campaign opposed the unit rule while the Reagan campaign supported it, saying that it would give the state more clout at the national convention. The measure passed by a vote of 161 to 62, overwhelmingly supporting the Reagan campaign's position. Fast forward a few months later, and the Mississippi delegation is still undecided. Neither President Ford nor former Governor Reagan had enough votes to secure them the nomination. According to the Associated Press, Ford had the support of 1,127 delegates, just 3 short of the 1,130 needed for the nomination, with Reagan at 1,036 and 96 still uncommitted. Mississippi's delegation was the biggest prize for those uncommitted delegates that were still available, especially since the Ford campaign knew that there were at least 3 delegates in the Mississippi delegation supporting the president. One Mississippi delegate, Gil Carmichael of Meridian, had been floating around the idea of Reagan being a vice presidential pick for Ford, even though Reagan called Carmichael a few weeks prior to ask him to stop talking about the rumor because it was, as the Mississippi Press reported, totally out of the question. But even before the delegation's votes, the cracks started appearing in the delegation. Mississippi Delegation Chair Charles Pickering publicly committed to Ronald Reagan on August 16th. The same day, President Ford met with the Mississippi delegation to support his candidacy, though many assumed that it was for the delegation to abolish the unit rule. Pickering's endorsement of Reagan, as well as the unit rule vote back in April at the state convention, indicated that all 30 of the state's delegates might go to the former California governor. But Reagan made a fatal mistake that would doom his 1976 presidential ambitions by announcing liberal Pennsylvania Senator Richard Schweikert as his running mate. Immediately, the Ford campaign pounced on the opportunity to label Reagan as a sellout to conservatives, and for the conservative delegations like Mississippi to not support Reagan. After the announcement and the apparent damage, Reagan spoke with the Mississippi delegation to tell them that he wasn't a sellout. However, he also said that he would not accept the vice presidential nomination behind Ford, nor that he would dump Schweikert as his vice presidential choice. For people like Clark Reed, who was a conservative purist, the acceptance of a liberal to the ticket like Schweikert was more of a sin than creating a center-right Big Tent party that Ford was trying to accomplish. Ironically, the main reason Reed supported Reagan was because he saw Ford as too moderate. The first indication that Reagan was losing the Mississippi delegation came on a vote on a motion by the Reagan campaign for Ford to announce his vice presidential pick before the presidential nomination balloting. Many saw this as a political ploy to lessen the blowback that he was receiving for picking Schweikert. Those who supported Reagan would vote for the motion, while those supporting Ford voted against it. When Mississippi voted, State Party Chairman Clark Reed announced that Mississippi was casting 30 votes as a unit against the motion. This indicated that Mississippi was now in the pro-Ford camp when it had been assumed Reagan was the favorite to win all of Mississippi's delegates. The next day, the delegation voted to support President Ford 16-14, with all 30 of Mississippi's delegates voting for Ford. In the end, the unit rule didn't matter, as 16 delegates would have put Ford over the top. And with that, Gerald Ford was the Republican nominee. But how do we get to this place? How was an incumbent president so close to losing his party's nomination, and how did Ronald Reagan emerge as the candidate to almost take down the president? In this video, we're going to look at the 1976 Republican Party nomination between President Gerald Ford and former California Governor Ronald Reagan. Welcome to Election History. My name is Dave, and I do videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the likes. If this is the type of content that you like, please subscribe to the channel and hit the thumbs up button right now if you can. You can also become a supporter of this channel by becoming a member on Patreon. Patreon members also see videos a day earlier, and starting with this video, we'll get extra post-production videos about historical facts on the latest video. Also, as many of you know, my video about the British Labour Party was taken down by YouTube for a copyright strike after 6 months. So becoming a Patreon member means that you can have access to these videos and help out if any other issues like that arise again. The link for the Patreon is down below in my description. 3 years before the Republican convention in Kansas City, Missouri, House Minority Leader Gerald Ford wasn't even being considered a presidential candidate. In a Gallup poll conducted in August of 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew was tied with current California Governor Ronald Reagan at 22%. Outgoing New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller was third at a distant 13%. But if you're watching this channel, you probably know what happened. Spiro Agnew resigned as vice president and was replaced by Republican House Leader Gerald Ford. But even with the new title of vice president, Ford was not being considered a serious candidate for the presidency in 1976. In a Gallup poll released on October 20th, 1973, Reagan was now the clear leader amongst Republican voters at 29%, with Nelson Rockefeller at 19%, former Democrat and Texas Governor John Connally at 16%, and Illinois Senator Charles Percy, who Nixon said he would do anything to make sure that he didn't reach the White House, at 14%. Ford, yet again, was not included in the Gallup poll. Still, even if Reagan were to win the nomination, a Gallup poll a week later showed that Reagan would lose in a hypothetical matchup between him and Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, 50% to 42%. Interestingly, in the Democratic primary polls, only Kennedy and Alabama Governor George Wallace were included, with Kennedy dominating 40% to 16%. But it didn't take long for Ford to gain traction. In a Gallup poll conducted in January of 1974, now Vice President Ford was at 24%, with Ronald Reagan at 20% and Nelson Rockefeller at 18%, making it a pure three-way race. But again, if you watch this channel, you know what happened. On August 9th, 1974, my cousin Richard Nixon resigned as president. Vice President Gerald Ford was elevated to the presidency. 11 days later, on August 20th, Nelson Rockefeller was nominated by Ford to be his vice president, thus eliminating one of his political rivals for the Republican nomination for president, something that Ford wasn't even being considered for a year earlier. All the political pundits said that the nomination was now Ford's for the taking. However, the selection of Rockefeller as Ford's vice president was considered a slap in the face of the conservative wing of the Republican Party, which had supported Barry Goldwater 10 years earlier, and was becoming a growing group within the party. But yet again, if you watch this channel, you probably know what happened next. On September 8th, 1974, President Ford pardoned former President Nixon for all crimes that he might have committed as president. Now, many political observers say this is when Gerald Ford lost the presidency. And if we look at the general election, that's probably true. But this was more of an issue for the Democrats than it was the Republicans. A few days after Ford's pardoning of Nixon, Ronald Reagan, while in Chicago, stated that he supported the pardoning of Nixon, saying, quote, "It is hard to conceive of any punishment greater than that already imposed," end of quote. At the same time, Reagan didn't say if he supported or opposed the pardoning of all involved with the Watergate scandal, saying, quote, "Because President Ford is still studying the matter," end of quote. Therefore, as much as we think about the Watergate scandal in the grand scheme of the 1976 election, it really had no impact in the Republican primaries. So, what were the issues that were driving Republican voters? Let's first look at foreign policy, since that's what most people think of nowadays when they see the Ford-Reagan matchup. Prior to Gerald Ford becoming president, the Nixon administration practiced the approach of détente regarding the Soviet Union. This focused on the relaxation of relations between the United States and their communist adversaries, particularly China and the Soviet Union. The Nixon and subsequent Ford administration felt that the lessening of tensions could lead to further arms reduction, as well as the possibility of opening up markets in communist countries which were filled with natural resources. On the other hand, conservatives in both the Democratic and Republican parties opposed détente mostly because the approach taken by the Nixon and Ford administration didn't address the issues of political freedoms and the opening up of society. Ford even went as far as to refuse to meet with Soviet dissidents because it could strain any progress made between the United States and the Soviet Union. And as I said, many people think that this is the main reason that Reagan decided to challenge Ford. But there were many more. One of the big issues was what the United States should do with citizens that dodged the Vietnam War draft and fled the country, mostly to Canada. Many Democrats and liberals argued that draft dodgers should be fully pardoned. After all, Ford had just pardoned Richard Nixon for any crimes that he had committed while president, so why should it be different for draft dodgers? As for the conservatives, they believe that draft dodgers should be sent to prison, since many Americans died in their place in Vietnam. Instead, the approach that Ford took was to provide conditional pardons on a case-by-case basis, enraging both sides. But the Vietnam War, which officially ended in April of 1975, also impacted the election culturally. One television show that ran during and after the Vietnam War was MASH, a show about a medical unit during the Korean War, but was considered as a show whose topics actually opposed the Vietnam War. Essentially, MASH challenged the concept of patriotism, especially blind patriotism. Therefore, many Americans who did not question the Vietnam War, which were almost exclusively conservatives, considered MASH to be anti-American. Those in the show who were seen as the strict patriots and die-hard military disciplinarians, such as Major Frank Burns, were often portrayed as hypocritical and an oaf. On the other hand, Hawkeye Pierce and Trapper John, those who were considered rebellious and seriously questioned the war, were seen as the heroes of the show. But MASH was just one crack in the cultural divide that was shaping up in the country, particularly among conservatives that felt that Hollywood and liberal society was pushing their lifestyle on them. One place where this came to a head was Kanawha County, West Virginia, where violent protests erupted against state-mandated changes to textbooks throughout West Virginia. The books that the state was implementing mostly focus on multiculturalism, but some were considered to go a little too far, like the autobiography of Malcolm X. In Kanawha County, one member of the school board, Alice Moore, strongly protested the move. Moore said that the books were, quote, filthy, disgusting trash, unpatriotic, and unduly favoring blacks, end of quote. She also said that books were anti-Christian, which shouldn't really matter because of that whole separation of church and state thing. Moore and her supporters made this a pro-white, pro-Christian, and so-called pro-American movement. Still, the books were implemented by the school board, and that resulted in 1 out of every 5 students being kept home from school as a protest by their parents. But it even went further. Bombs and dynamite were planted in schools, buses, and the school board building. School buses were attacked with shotguns, and rocks were thrown at houses where children were still attending school. With the prosecution and imprisonment of some of the leaders of the movement, the violence stopped. As far as Ronald Reagan, he sided with the parents who were opposed to the new textbooks. But instead of making this a racial or Christian issue, he made it an issue of local control over schools, arguing that the state shouldn't force a local community to adopt measures they didn't want. He would later use the Kanawha County incident as president to go after centralized control of local schools. But the issue wasn't just confined to Kanawha County and textbooks. The issue of busing to accomplish desegregation of public schools was still prominent in cities like Boston and Detroit. I talked about this in my video about George Wallace's 1972 campaign, but it was still a salient issue 4 years later. As was the case in 1972, the key issue was that white parents didn't want their children to go to predominantly black schools, nor did they want black students to go to schools in white neighborhoods. As in Kanawha County, parents in northern cities protested, with only 58% of students attending the first day of school in Boston in 1975. Also, as was the case in Kanawha County, the main reason, if not the only reason, for these protests was about the issue of race. As with the textbooks, Reagan sided with those who were against busing. And again, while the protesters continued to make the argument based on race, Reagan continued to be more diplomatic, saying that busing was federal government overreach in local school affairs. In 1970, as governor, Reagan signed into law an anti-busing bill stating, yet again, that he was trying to stop government overreach. Another non-racial issue that became prominent in the early 1970s was abortion. Up until this time, one was just as likely to meet a pro-choice Republican as they were a pro-life Democrat. But after the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which essentially legalized abortion nationwide, the right started to gravitate to the pro-life side while liberals gravitated to the pro-choice side. One of the reasons was the abortion issue's connection to religion. Up until the 1973 decision, abortion was considered a predominantly Catholic issue, with most Catholic voters still supporting Democratic candidates. But after the decision, which didn't get much press initially because it was decided on the day that former President Lyndon Baines Johnson died, as well as a few days after the Paris Accord that would somewhat end hostilities in Vietnam, Baptists from the South started making it an issue. The abortion issue, as well as race, started bringing together white, Christian, like-minded conservatives who felt that the Nixon and Ford administrations were opposed to their cultural values. And honestly, they had a point. Both Nixon and Ford were moderate on the issue of abortion and usually touted the line of being personally opposed to it while respecting the Supreme Court's decision. As for Reagan, he was kind of in a pickle. He did not want to alienate his conservative base, but as governor of California, he signed into law the 1967 Therapeutic Abortion Act, which liberalized current abortion laws in California. The day before signing the bill, Reagan said, quote, "I am fully sympathetic with the attempts to liberalize the outdated abortion law now in the books in California. I am confident that the people of California recognize that need and will support the humanitarian goals of the measure passed by the Assembly and Senate." End of quote. Prior to the act, abortion was illegal in California, but the act allowed abortions in certain cases. This was further liberalized by the 1970 California Supreme Court decision, People v. Bellows, which said that the act was too restrictive, thus making abortion legal in all cases in California. Because he signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act into law, which paved the way for complete legalization of abortion in California 3 years before Roe v. Wade, he had to change course. If Reagan were to make a run for the presidency in the future, it was becoming abundantly clear to him that the conservatives that he was courting were against any form of legalized abortion. As a result, Reagan's rhetoric on abortion started to change after the 1970 Supreme Court decision, saying that the court's decision was going to lead to on-demand abortions, with taxpayers paying for those abortions. But this also negated another argument that Reagan was making, that single mothers were living off the welfare system and simply having more children to get more government assistance. A. Alan Post, a legislative analyst, said that the liberalization of abortion laws in the state would save California approximately $8.5 million in Medicaid funds if abortion's restrictions were totally lifted. This shows a contradiction in Reagan's positions on both issues. Essentially, if someone had an abortion, they could not claim benefits for a child that doesn't exist. But Reagan didn't seem to care. He would continue to make both arguments even though they contradicted one another. With Ford now president and being the moderate Republican candidate, and Reagan the former frontrunner before Nixon's resignation being the choice of the Goldwater conservatives, the stage was set. Both candidates squeezed out paths for any other potential candidates. They also took their time in officially announcing their runs. Ford announced that he was running on July 8th, 1975, and yes, Ford's campaign was closely associated with George Herbert Walker Bush, which might explain why Ford made him the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Two people in the White House, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, were influential in the direction of the campaign. Eventually, before the convention, James Baker would become Ford's campaign manager. More on that later. As for Reagan, he took his time in announcing his candidacy. Even party insiders and Reagan supporters, like Mississippi Republican Party Chairman Clark Reed, said that it might be too late for Reagan to enter the race. Nonetheless, Reagan announced that he was running for president on November 20th, 1975, less than 2 months before the first convention in New York and caucuses in Iowa. Interestingly, in Miami, where Reagan made his announcement, somebody showed up there and approached Reagan with a toy gun, threatening to shoot him. Apparently, according to the FBI, this person had threatened both Nelson Rockefeller and President Ford in the past, so he was known to authorities. It's just something that I found very interesting on the day of him making his announcement, and unfortunately, a premonition of something that would happen a few years later. Even though the political lines were drawn, there was another intangible that gave Reagan somewhat of an advantage, which was public image. Of course, Reagan was a famous actor and would bring that Hollywood swag to his campaign. Even if Reagan spoke off the cuff, every time he spoke, it came off like a polished speech that he had been practicing for weeks. As for Ford, he was seen as a fumbler. Oddly enough, even though Reagan played football for a small, now non-existent college, while Ford played for the University of Michigan, it was Ford that was seen as the clumsy and unathletic candidate. His consistent tripping made him the butt of jokes on shows such as the newly created Saturday Night Live. He also made other gaffes, such as later in the campaign when he bit into a tamale without taking off the corn husk, with the incident being forever known as the Great Tamale Incident. While the Ford campaign was focused on getting enough delegates at a convention, Reagan's populist-style campaign was similar to the concurrent Jimmy Carter campaign, which I talked about in detail in this video. Essentially, Reagan hoped to gain momentum in early states, which would eventually lead to his victory. The problem that Reagan had was that he was not just running against the incumbent president, but only against one other candidate. Jimmy Carter was running against multiple candidates with different strategies, and with the party's biggest name, Ted Kennedy, not running against Carter yet. That would be 4 years later. The first major contest was the Iowa caucuses. While there was a New York convention, this was only a convention that affected a fraction of the delegates and were just filled with party loyalists that were unpledged. In Iowa, both sides were expecting to perform well. In fact, both sides expected to get a majority of the state's delegates. But in the end, Ford won 45.3% of the delegates to Reagan's 42.5%. While this could be considered a major upset by Reagan, similar to that of Eugene McCarthy against incumbent President Lyndon B. Johnson in New Hampshire in 1968, the Reagan campaign complained that the results were wrong, and they believed that Reagan truly won about 59% of delegates. This was a mistake by the Reagan campaign. They could have spun this off as a victory, or at least a moral victory, but instead spun it as if Reagan had underperformed. 3 weeks later, the two campaigns decided to fire up the rhetoric. As for Ford, he started talking about how Reagan would cut programs such as Social Security and Medicare. While Reagan remained silent on these issues, not really indicating if he would or wouldn't make these cuts, he decided to shift his attention to someone in Chicago named Linda Taylor. Taylor was a professional criminal who was said to have had 80 different aliases in which she filed for Social Security benefits and other social safety net benefits, including welfare assistance. She also filed police reports claiming stolen goods that she could have received insurance payments for, even though she never owned the items. As a result of her fraudulent activities, especially when it came to stealing welfare benefits, she became known as the Welfare Queen. While many attribute the Welfare Queen title to Ronald Reagan, it was actually the Chicago Tribune that called Taylor the Welfare Queen 2 years earlier when reporting on her activities in 1974. Now, before we get any further, it's important to understand the role of assistance to the poor in the mid 1970s. 10 years earlier, Lyndon Johnson passed the Great Society, which created Medicaid, which was medical assistance administered by the states and jointly funded by the state and federal government, as well as other benefits that saw joint federal and state cooperation. For many in conservative circles, the Great Society was seen as the transfer of tax dollars from whites to blacks. On May 8, 1968, presidential candidate George Wallace said in Indiana, quote, "The so-called Great Society is nothing more than a program to subsidize a racial minority that refuses to work while the white man is left holding the bill." End of quote. On March 17, 1965, U.S. Senator Strom Thurmond said, quote, "This legislation is designed to give the Negro race political power and economic advantage through the force of the federal government." End of quote. 2 years later, Thurmond said, quote, "The Great Society programs are being used to impose racial equality and racial integration on states against the will of their white citizens." End of quote. Georgia Governor Lester Maddox said on September 6, 1967, quote, "The Great Society has become a Negro society, paid for by whites who are told that they must like it." End of quote. James J. Kilpatrick, a conservative columnist, wrote, quote, "The Great Society seeks racial equality not as a moral aspiration, but as a federally enforced result." End of quote. Future North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms said, quote, "Race has been used as an excuse for building a massive Great Society welfare system that punishes whites who work hard and reward blacks who do not." End of quote. Now, I can go on for hours, but I think that you get the point that opposition to the Great Society, thus opposition to welfare, was seen through a racial lens by many. And in the case of Reagan, while he might not have used race in his quotes, he did seem to mostly side with the racist on welfare, as he did with the textbook battle in West Virginia and as he did with the busing issue. But in 1971, when talking about African leaders with Richard Nixon, Reagan said,
"And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did,
Yeah.
to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes."
Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The tail wags the dog.
So, yeah, I'll let you be the judge as to whether Reagan's campaign was racially charged or not. But let's get back to the welfare queen, Linda Taylor, who happened to be black. Now, in all fairness, when talking about the welfare queen, Reagan didn't mention her by name. But the fact that he said that she was from Chicago, had 80 different names, as well as other possible information about her case, such as the amount that she stole, which was reported at over $150,000, it was undoubtedly that Reagan was talking about Taylor. And while what Taylor did was a criminal act, Reagan tried to put all welfare recipients in the same boat as Taylor. But the problem with Reagan's story is that it simply wasn't true. Originally, the claims that were made were by Illinois State Senator Don A. Moore, a Republican that chaired a committee looking at welfare abuses in Springfield. The Chicago Tribune went with Moore's claims. However, the prosecutor in Taylor's case, James Piper, said that Taylor only used 4 fake names and she only stole about $8,000, not the over $150,000 that Reagan had claimed. Reagan would later claim that she made over $1 million and that she owned 3 Cadillacs, another claim that is not backed up by any facts. Reagan also talked about housing assistance, saying in New Hampshire, quote, "If you are a slum dweller, you can get an apartment with 11-foot ceilings, a 20-foot balcony, a swimming pool, and a playroom, and that rent begins at $113.20, and that includes utilities." End of quote. Again, these claims are not true and usually debunked by experts such as Robert Nickel from New York, the project coordinator for the project that Reagan was talking about, saying that there was no way that someone could get rent that low and that the apartments that had 11-foot ceilings, there were only 92 units, which had 6 bedrooms, were made for large families and could not be rented for a mere $113.20. Still, this didn't matter to Reagan. These were the stories, and he was going with them. He also talked about his welfare reforms when he was California's governor, stating that his legislation had taken 400,000 people off of welfare. The fact is that only 232,070 had been taken off of welfare during Reagan's term in office, another falsity by the Reagan campaign regarding welfare. Still, when Reagan went to these small towns in New Hampshire, he would repeat the same story every time. The welfare queen, cheap apartments, and how he got 400,000 people off of welfare in California, all of which were verifiably false. The New Hampshire primary was close, but President Ford won, winning 49.4% of the vote to Reagan's 48%. While Ford won the popular votes, as well as 18 of New Hampshire's 21 delegates to the National Convention, it was still another result in which neither candidate received a majority of the vote. Unlike Iowa, Reagan spun this off as a moral win, showing how close they had come to beating the incumbent president. Still, even though this was the case, it was Ford with the victory over Reagan. According to Rick Perlstein, Reagan's campaign was less optimistic about what happened on election night in New Hampshire. Their whole strategy had been to build on a quick win in New Hampshire, a quick win in Florida, a quick win in Illinois, and a quick concession from Ford. So far, the first part of this strategy didn't go their way. The next big primaries were to be in the states of Florida on March 9th and Illinois on March 16th. Though Ford was from neighboring Michigan, Reagan was a native of Illinois. As for Florida, Ford said, quote, "Florida is really the key. If we can win in Florida and win big, they, the Reagan campaign, ought to know that they can't win." End of quote. And Ford had good reason to feel good. Just 5 days before the primary, government statistics showed that the economy was picking up, with inflation and unemployment going down. As for Reagan, he started changing his campaign strategy. No longer were the issues about race front and center, though they were still part of the campaign stump speech. Instead, Reagan focused on foreign affairs, especially the Ford administration's handoff approach to communism, especially when it came to the ending of operations in Vietnam, the United States conducting a number of military blunders in Cambodia, and being non-committal in Angola's civil war, a war that Reagan saw as a proxy war between the United States and Cuba. Both candidates visited Florida and traveled around the state for a few days before the primary, with the Orlando Sentinel saying, quote, "Reagan has given his best in Florida, and if the state's primarily conservative Republican voters turn away from him here, most political observers agree the party would be all but over for the Reagan campaign." End of quote. Now, there is one important point to make about Florida. Many of the conservative voters that voted in the Republican primaries would more likely vote on foreign policy issues, such as preventing the spread of communism. Those who voted on issues of race were, at that time, still considered Dixiecrats and voted in the Democratic primary, where neighboring governors Jimmy Carter and George Wallace were likely to win most of the votes from these voters. On primary night in Florida, Ford won 53% of the vote and 43 delegates to Reagan's 47% of the vote and 23 delegates. As with the New Hampshire primary, Reagan spun this off as a moral win, saying, quote, "We are all delighted. We are in it for the long haul, all the way to the convention." End of quote. In fact, Reagan was already in Rock Island, Illinois on the night of the Florida primary, getting ready for the next primary. The Illinois primary was held on March 16th. Of course, this was Reagan's birth state, but Ford was expected to win. Former Republican governor of Illinois, Richard Ogilvie, said that Ford would win by a 2-to-1 margin, which the Ford campaign tried to tone down, with Ford's campaign manager, Bo Calloway, saying, quote, "I think we're going to win, but not by any big numbers, not anything like Ogilvie's 2-to-1 prediction." End of quote. Another Ford supporter, Congressman Edward Derwinski, even said of Reagan's campaign, quote, "The jig is up. You fellows are beat." End of quote. In Illinois, the Reagan campaign was getting desperate. State Representative Donnell Taunton of Hoffman State said that the Ford campaign was buying votes through outright bribery, which is actually a quote in the Chicago Tribune. Reagan even called Ford a liar since Ford's campaign was claiming that the early primaries were vital to winning the nomination. Reagan assured voters that they weren't and that there were many more primaries and conventions ahead. However, just 3 days before the Illinois primary, there would be a major shakeup and scandal in the Ford campaign. Campaign manager Bo Calloway was suspended because of charges that he exerted improper influence on federal officials to permit him to expand his Colorado ski resorts on National Forest Service lands. He was replaced by Stuart Spencer, a political consultant from California. The next day, the FBI joined in the investigation into Calloway. Still, many didn't expect this to hurt Ford's campaign. On primary night, Ford won 59% of the vote with a large victory, but not the 2-1 victory that had been touted by Ford supporters days earlier. Reagan stated that the results were within what they expected and was pleased. Ford's presidential assistant, Rogers Morton, said that North Carolina was the all-or-nothing primary for the Reagan campaign, saying, quote, "He will realize the nomination is out of his grasp. He will have to decide if he wants to be a salesman for the cause or part of the Republican Party." End of quote. One day after that quote, Morton became Ford's campaign manager. This brings us to the North Carolina primary held on March 23rd. This wasn't going to be easy for Reagan. On March 19th, North Carolina's Republican governor, Jim Holshouser, who was also Ford's Southern campaign coordinator, wrote a letter with 6 other Republican governors asking Reagan to drop out. Of course, Reagan refused and continued to campaign. He still talked about national security, but also brought welfare back into the campaign. Going into primary day, Reagan wasn't too optimistic, saying, quote, "I'm not going to make any predictions one way or the other," end of quote, and would continue to campaign after the North Carolina primary regardless of the results. However, on primary night, Reagan scored an upset, winning his first primary with 52.4% of the votes to Ford's 45.9%. According to the Charlotte Observer, quote, 2 out of 3 Republicans who made up their minds at the last minute voted for Reagan, and, quote, Reagan's vigorous personal campaign last week and his increasingly aggressive attacks on Ford's military and foreign policies captured previously undecided voters, end of quote. Interestingly, the Observer also said, quote, Reagan began his campaign last fall pledging to keep what he called the Republicans' 11th commandment, not attacking his opponent. But he began his final North Carolina blitz Thursday by charging the Ford administration with manipulating the economy for political purposes and with letting the nation's military strength lag behind the Soviet Union's, end of quote. The next primary state was in Wisconsin on April 6th. By this time, Reagan was constantly attacking Ford on foreign policy, saying that Ford's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was weak when it came to dealing with communists. Yeah, let that one sink in for a second. Anyway, after Reagan's continuous attacks, Ford finally came out and attacked Reagan, calling his comments irresponsible. And though he did fight back, it didn't have the impact that Reagan's attacks had on Ford in North Carolina. Oh, and it probably didn't help that All the President's Men had its world premiere in Hollywood just 2 days before the primary. Still, the Reagan campaign was running out of money and decided to forego Wisconsin's primary since it was a winner-take-all delegate primary. Ford would go on to win with 55% of the votes and all of Wisconsin's delegates. A few days later, on April 10th, the Mississippi State Convention voted to vote as a bloc at the National Convention, but stayed uncommitted, likely voting for Reagan at the National Convention. Spoiler alert, watch the beginning of this video. Over the next month, it was a mixed bag for both campaigns, but the Reagan campaign strategy was shifting with 2 major focuses. First, a number of states selected their delegates through state party conventions. In these contests, electability was more important than actual issues. Using this argument, Reagan would convince delegates in Arizona and South Carolina to support his candidacy on April 24th. He would continue to make the argument in a number of conventions to be held throughout the following months. The second part of his campaign was to win the next two big contests, in Texas and California. Of course, Reagan had a big advantage in his home state of California and seemed to be on good footing in Texas. This brings us to the Texas primary, which was held on May 1st. Ford, knowing that it would be a challenge, started campaigning in Texas 3 weeks before the primary. As for the campaign theme, it was the same for both campaigns. Reagan mostly focused on Ford's foreign policy, stating that the Ford administration was weak on communism, while Ford continued to say that Reagan's attacks were irresponsible. Interestingly, Reagan had abandoned his focus on social issues and now focused his campaign entirely on electability and Ford's foreign policy, continuing to say that Kissinger was weak. But as with the welfare queen's statements, Reagan was creating statistics about the US military and its preparedness that wasn't backed up by any facts, such as inflating the size of the Soviet military to make America's military look much smaller. But Ford also started making the electability argument. At a press conference 2 days before the primary, Ford said that he was, quote, conservative enough to win the Texas primary and middle of the road enough to win the election in November, end of quote. This was a change in tactics. Unlike the Illinois primary, where the Ford campaign tried to tone down any statements of large victories, in Texas he was saying that late momentum could help him win, playing up his chances more than the reality of the situation. Still, the Ford campaign did feel like they were popular amongst Texas Republicans. The problem for the Ford campaign was that Reagan was popular amongst Texas Democrats. See, by this time, the Democratic primary was basically over, with Jimmy Carter expecting to win easily in the Texas primary, which he did but didn't receive 50%. You can check out my video about Carter's primary here. As a result, many Democrats jumped over to the Republican ticket and voted for Reagan, giving him 66.4% of the votes. In fact, the vote was so lopsided, Reagan won all 96 delegates that were up for grabs, despite the fact that it was not a winner-take-all state. And let's not forget, Ford started campaigning weeks before the primary and intensively campaigned in the state. It wasn't like when Reagan blew off Wisconsin. Therefore, this was a huge blow to the Ford campaign. And the Ford campaign knew it wasn't going to get any better. Over the next few days, primaries would be held in Indiana, Alabama, and Georgia. However, Ford's spokesman, Peter Kay, said that all would be straightened out after those primaries. Kay also said that Reagan was probably getting votes from George Wallace supporters, which he called extremist, and said, quote, when Ford gets the nomination, he will have no problem in Texas, end of quote. As with Texas, the Reagan campaign strategy was the same in Indiana, where he hoped to get Democratic crossover votes to win, and that's exactly what he did. On May 4th, Reagan dominated the Indiana primary as a result of Democratic crossovers, as well as the Alabama and Georgia primaries. These landslide victories put Reagan into the delegate count lead just 6 weeks after he was pressured to drop out of the race. Over the next few weeks, there were a number of conventions where both candidates split the delegates about evenly. On May 11th, in the Nebraska primary, Reagan pulled off the win, but with only 54.5% of the votes, despite the fact that he had been organizing in the state for over a year. While Ford did well in Omaha and Lincoln, where the University of Nebraska is located, Reagan dominated rural Nebraska. But on the same day in West Virginia, Ford pulled off a win with 56.8% of the votes. Now, I find this result interesting because we usually want to delineate the MAGA movement to the so-called Reagan Democrats. As you probably know, Donald Trump dominated West Virginia in all 3 of his runs for president. But Reagan lost to Ford in West Virginia in the primary and would eventually lose the state to Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. West Virginia would eventually vote for Michael Dukakis in 1988 as well. This would indicate that the Democrats from the coal belt are not the same as Reagan Democrats from Macomb County, Michigan in the 1980s. It's just something I found interesting. The next primaries were on May 18th in the Ford strongholds of Maryland and Michigan, the president's home state. Ford won 58% of the vote in Maryland and 64.9% of the vote in Michigan, winning 98 delegates to Reagan's 29. Still, the Reagan campaign didn't focus on either of these states. Their main focus was on the primaries held a week later in Arkansas, Idaho, Kentucky, Nevada, Oregon, and Tennessee. All of these primaries played well into Reagan's hands, as many in the media expected Reagan to sweep all of these primaries. Ford spent a lot of time in Oregon and flooded Kentucky and Tennessee with money and political ads. Additionally, Reagan floated the idea of privatizing or selling the Tennessee Valley Authority, which to this day provides electricity throughout Tennessee and neighboring states at a reduced rate. In the end, Ford pulled off the upset, winning the popular vote in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Oregon. Before the Tennessee results were known, the Chicago Tribune said, quote, "Should the president cling to his narrow victory in Tennessee, Reagan will have been jolted even harder, since Tennessee is the kind of southern state which is part of his natural constituency." End of quote. Still, even with the losses, Reagan came out with a 24-delegate lead from all of the primaries. For the rest of May and throughout the month of June, there were some small primaries, but a lot of state conventions. For the Reagan campaign, their strategy was similar to what they had tried to do in Mississippi, which was to win the state convention and commit them to vote as a bloc. Many of the delegates did that, with Ronald Reagan dominating most of these state conventions, with a few going to President Ford. However, there were some shifts. In New York, which voted for an uncommitted delegate slate earlier in the year, now they were shifting strongly to President Ford, with 131 of 154 of New York delegates now pledging full support to Gerald Ford. Still, the California primary with 167 delegates was held on June 8th, along with the New Jersey and Ohio primaries. California was obviously important because it was Reagan's home state, but it was also a winner-take-all state. With that being the case, Ford didn't even bother campaigning in California. On the flip side, Reagan didn't campaign in New Jersey, and the campaign didn't even field a full slate of delegates. Therefore, the real battleground was Ohio. By the time of these primaries, the focus of the campaign changed to the Bush War in Rhodesia. First, Reagan said that he would send troops into Rhodesia, and then backpedaled, saying that he would only use troops as a peacekeeping force. But once the Ford campaign ran commercials saying that Reagan's approach was reckless, Reagan did a complete 180 and said that he never said that he would commit troops to Rhodesia, even though he had been on record saying otherwise. It was also during this time that Reagan supporters started talking about Reagan being Ford's vice presidential nominee, and that if that failed, starting their own third party. Reagan would go on to win the California primary, whereas Ford won both Ohio and New Jersey. Throughout the rest of the state party conventions, Reagan had the edge, but Ford was able to hold his own. With that being the case, neither candidate had enough delegates once the Republican convention started. But before we go to the convention, the Ford campaign switched campaign managers, with George H.W. Bush confidant James Baker now running the campaign. With Baker as his campaign manager, Ford's campaign was to be much more technical, focusing more on winning the delegates needed to secure the nomination. Knowing that Reagan was going to be a force at the convention, Baker flipped the electability argument and approached the convention delegates saying that Ford was truly the only candidate that could beat Jimmy Carter in November. When the convention started, the Ford delegation won a few votes on the floor and the platform committee, showing that the president was possibly the favorite to win. See, these platform votes sometimes are a predictor as to things to come, which was a good sign for Ford. Still, one of the proposals presented by Reagan supporters to the Rules Committee was for President Ford to announce who his running mate would be before the accepting of the nomination. As mentioned previously, Ronald Reagan had already announced Pennsylvania Senator Richard Schweikert as his running mate, and felt that Ford should do so as well. This would basically make Ford fall into the same trap that Reagan himself stepped into. But Ford wasn't stupid. He knew that he had the votes in the Platform Committee and thus knew that he had the votes in the Rules Committee. The proposal was turned down, and Ford would continue to float a number of names around, like conservative Democrat turned Republican John Connally and moderate Kansas Senator Bob Dole. He could play the entire political spectrum. Reagan made the first move, and it was fatal, something that Lyndon Johnson and Coke Stevens would learn about years earlier. More about that in this video. And with that, as well as the intro of this video, Ford would go on to win the nomination, with Reagan giving his famous speech about Republican Party unity in order to beat Jimmy Carter. Now that he was no longer the candidate, he was reinstituting the 11th commandment. He didn't campaign early in the general election for Ford, but came on later in the campaign to help Ford. He was used in a limited way, mostly being used in television and radio ads in the West. This might have helped Ford keep some Western states, such as California, but in the end, Ford would lose to Jimmy Carter. It has to be said that Reagan was far more of a team player for Ford than Ted Kennedy was for Jimmy Carter in 1980. I talk about that whole crazy situation in the video about the 1980 primary. And that's it. We've come to the end of this video. If Reagan had won the nomination, would he have won the election? If Ford had won re-election, thus able to run again in 1980, would Reagan have ever been president? Put your comments down below. And again, thank you all very much, and please support the channel by becoming a Patreon member in the link below. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.